Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the sixth session of the Abu Dhabi Strategic Dialogue. I would like to thank our host, Dr. Bassam Al-Kidbi, for her gracious organization. Okay, so today we're talking. This session is going to be focused on the military side. We spoke yesterday. We had a whole day where we looked at various aspects, regional. We looked at, war in Ukraine, Russia, economic issues. Today we're going to talk about the military dimension and how is this now impacting the global scene. We've seen many conflicts over the past few years, and this particular year we had this conflict, the continued war in Ukraine, we had the situation erupting in Sudan, Libya still going on, now we have the Gaza war, tension in the Indo-Pacific continues. Military activities have clearly intensified over the past few years. So in this session, we're going to have very distinguished speakers, as I think you can see in the biographies and the programs that you have, that you're going to have a very good input, insight from people, accomplished scholars on various sides. And we are lucky that we have people from the US and from China, the two big elephants in everybody's room these days. When you talk about anything on any subject related to geopolitical, defense, economy, today US, China dominate the discussions. And we are very lucky that we have people from both places in this panel. So I put on a list of questions that from my discussion with the panelists that I will be addressing, and we're going to have more of a dialogue rather than lengthy presentations in this session. So first, I would like to address my first question to Dr. Anthony Cordesman. Dr. Cordesman, we've seen there's a wide perception that there is an increase, a rise in defense spending. We've seen many countries in Europe announce, budget increases. Like, for example, Germany said they're going to spend $10 billion on defense in the next 10 years. The Polish are spending like crazy. Everybody in Europe also, we saw many countries in Asia, like South Korea, Japan, announce some new programs. Do you agree that there is an increase in defense spending today?
I think there are two problems with the question. One, the data are simply terrible.
Yeah.
So doing comparisons of data which come from different countries, defined in radically different ways, using sources that everyone sees as being largely unrealistic, doesn't tell you what's happening. I think what you do see is if you look at percentages of GDP and what countries announce as defense spending, no, you don't see an increase at all. The United States, when I joined the national security community, was spending 11% of its GDP on military forces. By the time Vietnam arrived, it was about 8%. During most of the Cold War, it was 6 to 7. And today, if you look at the actual budget figures, which are not the ones normally quoted by NATO, it's about 2.7. These are in the OMB data. I think that what you do see are some very radical shifts in the way people are actually spending. So you mentioned Germany. First, we have to see if Germany actually spends the money Second, if we look at NATO reporting, most of the countries don't meet the 2% goal, and they haven't met it for a decade. And basically, what that shows up, if you look at the IISS military balance, is an awful lot of countries, frankly, haven't maintained their forces or their capabilities. You mentioned Poland, that's an exception. I think yesterday somebody talked about arms control. Well, the United States and Russia are radically modernizing their nuclear forces, their delivery systems, the actual weapons holdings. China is increasing its forces from a very small forces so that, for example, in the last year, you've seen satellite photos of 300 new ICBM sites. When you look at what Putin said about nuclear modernization, he cited 4 major nuclear weapons. But in every case, you didn't see some massive strain on the economy. I think when you look at a lot of these other shifts, perhaps one of the most striking ones from a US viewpoint is what we call low domain warfare. That's taking all of the assets, satellites, sensors, weapons, trying to integrate them across service lines, across generations of equipment. That will probably revolutionize the nature of conventional warfare over the next decade. But the US so far has been able to find a tentative plan for the Marine Corps. We can't agree on what the plan is for any of the other 3 services. We've seen a major shift toward precision warfare from the shortest range systems to the longest range. And more of these are being tied to targeting systems, which can be far more precise than in the past. And for you in the Gulf, that takes on a very special meaning, because if you know precisely the component in a desalination plant which takes the longest to repair, or you can hit a refinery with that level of precision, and let me note that Iran came fairly close earlier, you're talking about major changes in conventional strike capability that go far beyond conventional warfare. I think that you look at some of the other issues, you're having an air show here. And we have what are sometimes called 5th and 6th generation aircraft. Well, about 4 days ago, the US flew its first B-21 bomber flight. All of those aircraft that you will see at that show will have been designed and built before you see a conversion to all domain warfare and to a different concept of air power, missile power, and conventional concepts. And China has the same concepts, as to some extent does Russia. The difference is that the United States and China can afford it. When you talk about defense spending, let me just mention that we have a 23 or a $25 trillion economy. China's about 17.9. Russia, which for a long time was seen as one of the major global powers, has an economy which is all of 2.2 trillion, which is something like a tenth of the US GDP. It is a superpower in one sense. It has a vast inventory of nuclear weapons and older weapons it's inherited. It doesn't have the money to compete with many other countries. Great Britain now has a greater gross domestic product than Russia does. And even if an authoritarian economy can spend more. I guess the last points I would really make about this are that we also, when you look at these figures, defense spending, the problem with that is it doesn't include internal security. It doesn't include the military forces that are in most authoritarian states where the actual defense budget does not come close to reflecting the total cost of state control and soft power in the military sense. So what you have is a whole heritage of kind of, well, order of battle analysis that goes back about 2 or 3 decades and has become, in many ways, militarily irrelevant. And it's always kind of interesting to go from the Pentagon and the National Security Council to some of the estimates in the academic world, because it's almost as if we went into two different planets. And with that cheerful note, let me turn it over to others.
Thank you. Colonel Zhou, a lot of tension in the Indo-Pacific region, and a lot of talk about the competition with the US. US, China, the issue of Taiwan, and a great deal of concern globally, Asia in particular, about the activities. Is China today beginning to project its power to present itself or assert itself as a new superpower? Or is this part of domestic politics that is being practiced with some international applications?
Thank you, Riad, and good morning, everyone. And I would like to take this opportunity to express my heartfelt thanks to the Emirates Policy Center and to Dr. KB personally, because this is my first time to attend the conference. But unfortunately, for the first two, I actually attended virtually. So I'm really, really happy to be here in person. Actually, if I look around, well, just now the last gentleman has turned up, and before he actually turned up, I suddenly realized, how the world might be influenced by American, China, altogether. And this also reflects how people might think about this relationship. It's always American speaking first, followed by China. This is all right, right? But you see, it was fascinating yesterday. Actually, I have not heard much about China-US. But if you listen to Americans, from time to time, China will crop up as a kind of a challenge or rival, so on and so forth. But anyway, this is the world today. Let me come to the question. Yeah, I think the United States, if it really wants to be focused on the Indo-Pacific. And why is that? I personally believe this is a reflection of Americans' declined power, because if you talk to Americans that the United States has declined, they're not happy. But if you say the United States is relatively declined, they have to admit. The fact is, after the Second World War, Americans' GDP would be half of the world. And now it's 25% of that of the world. Of course, the American space has declined. And now Americans' focus or shifted to the Indo-Pacific is because it could not manage, being a global policeman. Therefore, it has to become focused. But the question is, can the United States really be focused on Indo-Pacific and specifically on China? Right now, we are seeing two wars, right, which would definitely distract Americans' attention. One in in Europe, another in the Middle East. But luckily, we're not seeing the third war, in the Indo-Pacific. Then, now I need to talk about China's intention in that region. So much has been said that there could be a war between China and US in Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. My personal assessment is South China Sea actually is more dangerous than Taiwan Strait. Why? Very simple. Because in South China Sea, the United States would keep on sending aircraft and ships to challenge China's so-called excessive maritime claims, right? By closing reconnaissance, surveillance, and freedom navigation operations. So, but the PLA, the Chinese military, is getting stronger. So if the Chinese military is getting stronger, it would become less tolerant with what it perceived to be American provocations. China is the only country that would respond to what it perceived as American provocation militarily. No other countries would do that. Every year, the United States would send its Navy to challenge, for example, last year, the 22 excessive claims by 15 countries. All other countries would be silent, but China would respond militarily, either by giving warning or by following American ships, at sea, or by sending aircraft, to give warnings to visiting the American aircraft. So in South China Sea, we are passive. Americans keep on coming, and they cannot afford not to come because this is a tradition, and that is why this danger is really, really growing. According to an American report a couple of weeks ago, China would send the aircraft for 180 interceptions in the last 2 years. That means we would conduct interception once in every 4 days. This seems to be provocative on Chinese side, but the question is, where did it happen? It happened in Chinese waters. It happened near Chinese waters and in Chinese airspace and in China's exclusive economic zone. It did not happen in the waters of the continental USA. Then the question about Taiwan. Why Taiwan is less dangerous? Because whether we would resolve it militarily or not, it depends very much on how Beijing might think, right? So we are actually, taking hold of this issue. But then I would tell you that the Chinese government is still patient. Why? I do not want to give you rhetorics to say how China wish for peace, so on and so forth. Let me tell exactly with the example of the first question, defense budget. Actually, in the introduction of this session, the figure about Chinese defense spending is a little bit misleading, in that China is not having 7% growth over defense spending in terms of GDP. Actually, it happened a lot. This 7% is correct. It's only in comparison with last year. What I need to tell you is that in the whole world, well, this kind of fast increase in defense spending is seen everywhere. In Germany, as mentioned, in Japan, which has doubled its defense spending, China, for 4 decades, still maintain a growth rate of defense spending less than 2%. That means it is lower than NATO standard. This is a fact. And what does this fact tell you? Defense budget would never lie about a country's intention, about your confidence about yourself, about how you assess the environment, and even about how you look at your rivals. And in this relationship between China and the US, it tells you in volume about how China is confident about its own strengths and about its confidence in managing this relationship. It tells us so many things. So, what is my hope for China-US relationship? One word: manageable. But the question is, can it be managed? It's very difficult along Chinese coast, but it's so easy elsewhere. Why? Because Chinese military has no intention to police the world. If you look at the PLA's operation overseas, which are basically peacekeeping, counterpiracy in the Gulf of Aden and Somali Basin, and disaster relief, they are all humanitarian in nature. So elsewhere in the world, the Chinese military is behaving like a good Samaritan in Bible, providing just humanitarian assistance to people around the world. China is not killing anyone in the world. For the last 4 decades, Chinese soldiers have only killed 20 Indian soldiers with clubs, with fists, with sacrifice of 4 Chinese soldiers on Chinese side. And that is all. And that is unprecedented in human history to indicate the peaceful rise of a big nation like China. So we're not competing with the US militarily and globally, but within the Western Pacific, and especially in China's water and territory, this is a sovereignty issue. And we will not give in on such matters of sovereignty. But so I think China's relationship with the United States is difficult to manage militarily, especially because why? We can learn some lesson from the Cold War. During the Cold War, the 2 bitter enemies, in spite of total distrust, have actually reached so many agreements, especially in nuclear fields, in START, in SWORD, in open sky trading, so on and so forth. And why is that? Because the 2 militaries, in terms of the military strength, are almost on a par. So they can afford to talk to each other, and they're not that afraid of each other. So therefore they can talk, they can make agreements. But between China and the US military, within the Western Pacific, it's a very difficult story to say who is stronger, because Chinese military is growing fast, and the US military has to have a global presence. Therefore, this is a patchy picture. I'm not going to say who wins, but anyway, you understand. This happens at China's doorstep, right? It did not happen. It has not happened at the doorstep of the United States. Let me stop here for first. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. Mr. Heath, based on what we've heard, do you see a change or a breakdown in the global order? And how do you think this is going to impacting, are we going to see an increased conflict? How do you see things proceeding, based on what we've heard, and what your perception of the possible breakdown in global order?
Thank you for the questions. And first off, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Kepi and organizers of this conference. Thank you and congratulations to the Emirates Policy Center for their 10th anniversary. It's my first time in this country, and I'm really, truly delighted to be here. It's been a real privilege. Really appreciated hearing Colonel Zhou Bo's comments, and there's so much I would like to respond to, but mindful of the time, allow me to first offer my remarks, and then I hope in the Q&A we can talk a little bit more in detail about some of these other issues, especially regarding China and the US, which is my area of expertise. However, before I get to China and the US, allow me to make 3 broad points about trends in warfare and conflict in the world. First point I will make is to emphasize that most conflict in the world is actually civil war, and civil war with international characteristics, not state-on-state war. That's an important point to think about when we try to understand global patterns in defense spending. Second point I want to touch on is that these patterns of conflict are driven in part by a breakdown in the international order and the spread of a more violent multipolarity. And this is further aggravated by the competition by many countries, not just the US and China, but there are many countries in competition. And then third, I want to talk about some of the implications for the future of conflict. I am, in some ways, hopeful in that I think the odds of a major war are pretty low. I really do not think the US and Chinese militaries will fight. However, I think the likelihood of violence and conflict spreading around the world will probably grow, and we should think about how we might prepare for that. So to my first point, data overwhelmingly makes clear that Russia-Ukraine aside, most conflict in the world is primarily civil war in nature or civil war with what I call international characteristics, that is, great powers or middle powers get involved and aggravate the problem of conflict. The research is pretty clear that when great powers get involved in civil wars, the civil wars usually become more violent, more bloody, and longer lasting. And we're seeing this pattern, actually the spread of this type of civil war, internationalized civil war, has exploded in number since 2000 by about 9 times. And we see examples in the headlines. Russia-Ukraine is, it is a state-on-state war, but certainly U.S. is involved in other countries. We have Saudi Arabia and Iran getting involved in the civil war in Yemen. And there are other examples. Syria is another example. So this type of conflict requires or relies on different types of weapons than traditional state-on-state war. In particular, in a lot of the recent conflicts, we've seen the popularity of armed drones and even low-tech weapons like artillery and small arms. And these don't cost as much as stealth fighters, which are largely irrelevant to these kind of fights. And this paradox of the spread of conflict and the relatively restrained spending on expensive conventional weapons can be partly explained by understanding the nature of the conflict today. That's most common. Second point, breakdown in international order and the spread of a violent multipolarity. Now, I'm sure the Chinese government has for many years applauded the onset of multipolarity and the decline of unipolarity. But as they say in America, be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. And we're seeing, in fact, that the breakdown of the American-led order does not bring in a peaceful multipolarity, but what it is leading to is a spread of violent multipolarity in which many countries are struggling for influence to fill in the gap where American influence has receded. And we're seeing that in this part of the world where Saudi Arabia and Iran are contending, and Israel is contending with Iran in its own struggles, and other parts of the world as well. Not only that, I would argue that the breakdown in international consensus and the weakening of political legitimacy in many states invites international involvement. I already mentioned the pattern of internationalized civil war. This is very much related. Countries are struggling to rebuild an order or rebuild partnerships as the old order decays, and this is fueling much of the conflict. I'll just add one point about the US and Chinese competition. It is important to note that although the Chinese military has made some very impressive gains and added many new capabilities, including their 3rd aircraft carrier and some very impressive stealth aircraft and missile inventories, there is, in my opinion, no chance that the Chinese military will ever come close to catching up to the US, and that the US military advantage is decisive and will remain so for the foreseeable future. It's worth highlighting that the Chinese military, it remains a largely regional military that can operate almost exclusively in the first island chain with only limited ability to project power outside of there. And the US, by contrast, is a global military. And this is not even factoring the issues of alliances, which augment US power by manyfold. China, of course, has virtually no allies, and that leaves its position militarily quite weak around the world. So I think the competition is intense, of course, between US and China in the Indo-Pacific, but beyond that, the Chinese really have a minimal military presence around the rest of the world. And I do concede that their lack of involvement in wars is notable, but it's also pointing out that this is a luxury that China has been able to enjoy in part due to the fact that the U.S. has been doing a lot of the fighting and efforts to maintain international order. As the U.S. retrenches, China is likely to find risks of violence and conflict grow along its own periphery, and the temptation for the PLA to get involved, I think, will be harder and harder to resist. Last, what does it mean for the future? I think the cost of and the risks of conventional war are still so high that, in my view, there is just very little incentive at all for the US and Chinese to go to war. Same with the US and Russia. The risk of nuclear weapon use is just too dangerous for these countries, and the stakes simply don't justify that sort of risk. So if the risk of great power war is low, that may be good news, but the bad news is, as I pointed out, the problem of civil war and internationalized civil war is growing. And where is it growing? And the countries who are suffering from this, well, unfortunately, it's the countries who always suffer. The poorest and the weakest countries who have the lowest capacity for governance, they're the ones who are experiencing this in the most acute forms. The likelihood that climate change and a U.S. that's downsizing its commitments internationally will offer fewer resources to help other countries. These sorts of trends, I think, suggest even further bad news, because this will add further stress on the poorest countries and the most vulnerable. They're likely to see growing violence, and this will probably spread first in the poorest countries, in Africa, parts of Southeast Asia like Myanmar and Philippines, and perhaps in parts of the Middle East that are under immense stress, like Syria. But there's a very real risk that this sort of civil conflict will spread to other countries, and we must think about ways to manage this. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks again.
Thank you. Robert, I know one of your main tasks at IISS is your work on the military balance. How do you see now all these conflicts we heard about, especially here in the Middle East region, impacting? Do you see an increase in spending? How do you see this increase going? What's the trend in it? And how do you evaluate the impact of the localization of defense industries in some countries here in the region? Is it helping bolster, or is it having a negative effect? Do you see what's the positive and negative sides of this localization trend we see in many countries?
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and a very interesting question. I also wanted to say I thought some of the interventions from my colleagues, I hope we can dive into some of these issues in more detail in the Q&A. I'm very curious about the issue on arms control that the Colonel raised. I'm quite really interested to hear what he has to say. I'm just generally curious how we get someone like China into that modus like the US and Russia once were. And obviously that's fallen apart too, but hope we can get back to that.
We're going to get back to arms control in the second round.
To address your specific question, I mean, clearly the trend on defense spending is going in one direction, and it's going up almost everywhere. In some countries, given inflation rates, some of that's been a bit dented, so actually in real terms, even though the absolute numbers are going up, they haven't really gone up. But really, if you look across the board, it's been going up. In Europe, where a lot of the countries had money and often didn't spend, the Russia situation clearly changed that, and I don't see that reverting anytime soon. Certainly not as long as the situation in Moscow doesn't change or the policies don't change. Although I do think in Europe there would be a mindset to revert to other lower levels of defense spending if they thought the global security situation allowed that. Asia, obviously, we are seeing a lot of increases, and I don't see that changing either. We can probably argue about why that's happening, but I think that's also a trend, and I think that's less likely to subside anytime than, for example, in Europe. And so I think, yeah, as we've addressed, I mean, the world is pretty unstable right now, and that obviously drives the situation. And so I don't really think that we're in for a period of lower defense spending anytime soon. As to your issue on defense industrial issues, that's, to me, always very interesting. So, you know, obviously defense is a core role for every government and will attract money and attention. And instinctively, you look around the world and you see, you know, the dominant military powers also come with a big, impactful defense industry. The US has one, obviously, in all domains. China is building one and is really there in many domains already, and comes also with attractive pricing, purchasing power parity, and so on. It makes a difference. Europe, obviously. So I definitely see the temptation. And you look at countries like Korea and Turkey. They've built up an arms industry, and they've gone from being often small suppliers to niche needs to now being global players. That is absolutely attractive. I guess my question is that the best place to spend your money if you're not one of those countries? And again, I see the temptation, but I sometimes think that, I guess my view is countries can sometimes be a bit like companies, and if you want to do everything, you're probably not going to do it very well. You're going to have a, you know, you're good at one thing or one or two things, and maybe focus on that. And if defense industry isn't your thing, why spend a lot of money on it? You have, in most cases, lots of options. You have partnerships that come with that, often very attractive partnerships with defense partnerships. So rather than spending billions of dollars on ventures again and again that may not get anywhere, I guess I'm not convinced that is a great return on investment. Again, I see the attraction. There's probably nothing wrong with that if you have the money to throw out. But again, I sometimes think for national defense, that's not necessarily the best thing. And to pick on Dr. Cordesman's point, think of defense spending beyond military kit, tanks, bullets, planes. If you think of it as national resilience, then there are other places perhaps to spend that money to actually make your country stronger rather than building up, you know, the 25th UAV maker. You know, I think that market is probably pretty saturated. So again, you know, every country obviously can make their own judgments. I just question for some of the ones that are spending billions now whether that is really a great ROI.
Thank you. Anthony, if we get back to you, we'd like to, in this round, talk about arms control. We saw a breakdown in the arms control that was built during the Cold War era, you know, with the Russians retreating from one treaty after the other. So how do you see this is impacting global security, you know, with Russia abandoning, especially when it comes to nuclear arms control?
I think that this is a subject which probably requires at least some exposure to what weapons holdings really are and what happened with actual arms control. Russia at this point, I think last week, canceled the last functional arms control agreement that it had, which was one on conventional forces. It had canceled all of the agreements previously that effectively dealt with nuclear weapons. But you have to look at what those agreements actually did. At sort of the peak of nuclear deployments, when tactical nuclear weapons dominated the forces in Europe, you had something like 21,000 nuclear weapons in inventory for the nuclear powers, which then included Britain and France. They were reduced to about 1,400 strategic nuclear weapons as active weapons by the arms control over time. And that did lead to very significant reductions in deployed nuclear systems. You did withdraw and destroyed a lot of the nuclear weapons that had been produced during the peak of the Cold War. What was missing in all of those arms control agreements was first, the numbers that in the conventional force agreements had been agreed were totally irrelevant. The breakup of the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact meant the agreement basically didn't bind anybody in any way related to the balance in Europe. In terms of the strategic nuclear weapons, it's a little hard, without taking far longer than everybody has, to explain just how much the nature of nuclear warfighting has changed in terms of precision, reaction time, and battle management. And I suspect that I am probably the only person in this room, you can stand up if I'm not correct, that's actually been involved extensively in actual nuclear war games and seen what happens when you actually begin to use these devices. But as you have moved more and more to hyper-urbanization and you've changed manufacturing bases, and you now can have almost perfect confidence in launch on warning in choosing between striking at the other side's forces and striking at civilian targets, nobody would fight a nuclear war today, if we had to have one, on anything like the basis we did during the Cold War. Now, what is exempt from this, and is not an issue involving China and Russia, and I could disagree with the Colonel on virtually every point, but I hadn't really come here for yet another routine exchange of US and Chinese tension and counterclaims. What I think is far more important is what Russia has been doing. Because within Russia's holdings and the US, you have roughly another 4,000 active nuclear weapons in storage, which can be deployed as tactical or theater nuclear weapons, which meant at virtually almost any time you could see a major surge in nuclear deployments from the two major powers. Now, China doesn't have this history. I don't think anyone would estimate they've been concealing tactical or theater nuclear weapons. As you increase the range and accuracy and delivery of so many missiles, whether they're ship or air-carried or land-based, many systems which can carry a large conventional warhead, particularly in Russia's case, seem to be designed so they could rapidly be made dual-capable. So you have to understand that when you talk about the decline in nuclear arms control, you had this anomaly. And when you see Russia talking about deploying weapons to Belarus, for example, and you look at the design of so many long-range conventional strike systems, the arms control agreements that you really had were not the arms control agreements that most people who've never actually gamed or planned nuclear conflicts thought they were dealing with. And I think what this raises for all of us is not who is right or who is wrong, but how do you fix this situation if you can? Because one way or another, you have to integrate arms control so it meets the needs of Russia, China, and the United States. It can't be bilateral anymore. You have a major nuclear arms race between Pakistan and Russia. You have nuclear weapons in North Korea and a somewhat irresponsible government there. I think that this is an area for centers like this and others to work hard numbers and real-world weapon systems. Anybody can set good goals. I think, in all due respect, I agree completely that the majority of actual conflicts have tended to be conflicts between weak or failed states or factions within them recently. But the reason that we have had success in deterrence is we had a balance. We don't have that balance anymore, and it doesn't reflect the real-world evolution in warfare. And hoping that somehow all of this will go away because you have good intentions among a group of analysts while you don't have good intentions among countries is a somewhat dangerous assumption.
Thank you. Colonel, we've sensed some reluctance, or is there a reluctance in China to join arms control regimes? Does China support having arms control treaties, with US and possibly other nuclear powers? What do you think, China's stance or view on this, on the arms control regimes?
Very good question. When we talk about arms control, actually it's in many different areas, whether it's in nuclear area, conventional weapon control, or some other things. But this is a really good question. First of all, on China's attitude toward this kind of nuclear disarmament, yes, China stands, totally for this kind of disarmament, but the devil is in the details. The question is, if you want China, sit down together with the United States and Russia, is it possible? No, it's not possible. First of all, Russia has actually withdrawn from CTBT. And why did that happen? Because Russia's conventional force is proven to be not so effective in the battlefield in Ukraine. So therefore, we're seeing a lot of, seeing world threats on nuclear weapons. It came from President Putin. It came from Medvedev, and so all this demonstrates that Russia is actually relying more and more on nuclear weapons. And I'm the first Chinese who said, "Don't use nuclear weapon, Mr. President." I wrote that in Financial Times, and you can imagine, as a Chinese, I really, really need to take a deep breath to write an opinion like that, given the good relationship between China and Russia. But my instinct is there, because I'm not talking about China-Russia relationship. I'm talking about don't use nuclear weapons. And this is the ironclad, crystal clear Chinese policy. Even somebody in China might criticize me. I think on this point I'm right? And to my great surprise, after my opinion is published in Financial Times, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz came to visit China in a week's time. And President Xi Jinping mentioned it quite clear to him that no nuclear weapons should be used in Europe. And again, he repeated that during his meeting with President Biden in Bali in G20. So, coming back to your question, Russia would not like it. And for China won't like it either. Why? Because in China, nobody really talk about how many nuclear weapons we have. This is kind of a secret. But according to statistics, China might have 500 nuclear warheads, according to CIPRI, but that still is way, way below American standard. So for us to come into a talk, either we hugely increase our number of nuclear weapons, or Americans would hugely reduce its nuclear weapons. Neither is possible, and that is why. But I personally believe we should have some discussions in new areas, which are cyber, AI, and outer space. Why? Because in these new areas, the gap between China and the US, I assume, is not so big. And these new areas were not really found during the Cold War. That is why they're new areas. And we can afford, to discuss about matters in these areas. For example, like cyber. This kind of discussion is difficult because this kind of cyber attacks are always murky. People would not admit that I'm launching an attack on you. But still, I believe China and US could do as was found between the United States and Russia, not to attack, the critical facilities of the other side. So this kind of pledge could be made. Again, in AI, the most important thing is make sure human control over the artificial intelligence when it comes to, for example, nuclear command and control, which everybody understands is critically important. Then in outer space. And what are the problems with outer space? The problem with outer space is if anyone attack even one satellite in low orbit, it is attack on everybody, given debris it could create, right? For example, a country like China, United States, Russia, or India, who have demonstrated this kind of ASAT capability of launching an attack on the satellite, if you just destroy 10 satellites, then how many debris it would create on the orbit? Then it is danger for the satellites of all countries. The second thing is, this is my belief, an attack in outer space is a prelude of a nuclear war or a part of a nuclear war, right? Because you can hardly attack 1 to 10, because that would not be useful. If Elon Musk would send more than 10,000 satellites to orbit, and could you just lock down all of them? And if you want to do, you must do at least a few hundred at the same time. So it is massive, and it is a kind of a, Star War already. So this is the area that we need to talk about. But when we talk about, there are two different schools. China would say, no deployment of weapons whatsoever in outer space. Aren't we having enough trouble on Earth? And why should we have another war in outer space? I think this makes sense. But Americans would simply argue, no, your idea is too idealistic. It's simply impossible. Let's talk about rules of behavior. Just like, traffic rules. Because it is inevitable, how can we make sure that we can ensure that so many cars can actually travel on this orbit with safety? That's a different approach. But China would not disagree to this kind of approach. But we believe that if all countries could come to an understanding that no nuclear weapons should be deployed in outer space, just like we have agreed, no deployment of weapons in the moon. We have the Moon Treaty. If we are not allowed to deploy weapons in moon, why can't we decide don't deploy any weapons in outer space? I think this can be agreed, and then we can talk about responsible behavior at the same time, because the rule of responsible behavior could be part of the whole package. And the Chinese space station was approached by Elon Musk satellites 2 times. So of course we also want to ensure about our own safety. We would encourage this kind of talk. But these should be new areas that I believe China, United States, and other stakeholders could join to discuss.
Thank you. Mr. Heath, I'd like to see your view on the Chinese stance on arms control, and what do you think the US or the West could do or should do to make things more attractive, more convincing to China to join arms control regimes, whether it's on nuclear or space or conventional?
Well, first off, I agree with the Colonel that it is a good idea to start talks in these new domains of cyber, space, in particular. These are areas where escalatory dynamics are not well understood, and these are domains that have the potential to do a great deal of harm to not just militaries, but civilian populations. And therefore, I think it's a good idea if the US and Chinese governments start talks on how to manage that area and reduce risks. In terms of the nuclear weapons and other weapons, we didn't even talk about some of the intermediate range ballistic missiles and other missile systems that the Chinese have been growing at a rapid rate and piling on massive inventories for years, while the U.S. has not. I think it is in China's interest to be open to having dialogues about capping and minimizing those inventories, because it is destabilizing when countries start an arms race and start expanding missile inventories, especially when they're aimed at each other. Nuclear weapons, I understand the Chinese government's argument that they have a small number of warheads compared to the US and the Russians, but their reluctance to get involved in arms control talks with the US government has incentivized the US to energize its own nuclear modernization program. So it is this fear and suspicion in the US that the Chinese are not interested in talks and not interested in controlling this danger that is in large part motivating the US to re-energize its nuclear modernization program. So I think in overall, these issues of arms control are hugely important, and it would be in the benefit of all countries if the great powers, US, China, Russia, and others, did more to engage in dialogue and find ways to mitigate some of these risks. Thanks.
Thank you. Robert, would like to have a take on the arms control?
Really just briefly to say, it's encouraging to hear from our Chinese participant here that there is interest in arms control in several domains. I think it'd be nice to also, I was a bit saddened to hear that you didn't think it's possible right now in nuclear. I just think that's a bit of an opportunity lost if we have to wait till we get to a world where both sides again have thousands of nuclear warheads before we can start engaging. Even opening the talks about how to reduce, that seems unnecessary, frankly, but so be it. It's good to know. And I definitely agree, it's good to hear that there's appetite for talks on challenging issues, maybe even more challenging topics than nuclear arms control, for example, AI and cyber, because it's much harder to define and bound. It's one of the reasons I'm actually been hopeful that the U.S. and China would start talking arms control or engaging in some sort of arms control talks, maybe with others, on nuclear, because it is actually a rather easier problem than AI and cyber is to some extent, because it is a specific thing you're talking about. Yes, you could use ballistic missiles as another example. AI is not a specific thing, which makes arms control there very difficult. It's still evolving, it's very amorphous, so I would actually think it would be good for stability if the two sides, with others, if they're so interested, would engage in nuclear, if nothing else, to start building a culture of engaging and figuring out how to sort through issues. And on the counterspace issue, I think that's a great example. If there is a difference in how to approach this issue, then how better than to try to bridge those differences than to start engaging in some sort of formal talks, rather than just say, well, we want to ban it all, you only want to ban specific, or set some rules of the road, or conversely from the other side, we want to be very specific about rules of the road, you want to just make grand statements, so obviously there's different ways of interpreting the positions, but nuclear gives, we have a format, we know roughly what can work, there are mechanisms that are tried and tested, so I would argue it would be a great opportunity for the two parties to start engaging.
Thank you. Well, we have 14 minutes left, so I will take only 3 questions, hear them, and then we'll get a chance 2 minutes for each, or we'll have just the direct questions too. But my aim is to finish at 10:15. This is the guidance from the organizers here. So I'm going to take just 3 questions. Please, quick questions. Avoid long remarks. All right? So my first question will be to, I'll ask Mr. Walter. Walter, sorry, Badr Shatri, sorry, Badr Shatri. Sorry. Walter,
Walter is enough.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Wang yesterday emphasized the strategic culture of China, and China is always interested in peaceful solutions. Colonel Zhou, you said it in a similar way, that China is very tolerant against the events in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. On the other hand, we hear President Xi Jinping, who is telling his army, the People's Army, to be ready to take over control of Taiwan in 2027. What does it mean? How is it to be understood?
Thank you. Al-Badr al-Shatri.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just have a very quick question regarding, as it stands now, Dr. Heath spoke, the gap, the military gap between China and the United States is huge. But both Colonel Zhou and Dr. Heath didn't talk about the potential of Chinese growth as its economy or economic ambition is expanding, and it needs the military wherewithal to protect those economic interests overseas. Secondly, we're already noticing some indicators of the growth of blue water technology and air carrier development. So what is the potential of those all military indicators in the growth of Chinese military power? The potential, not the actual.
And Mr. Mashal Harthi.
أعتقد أن
I think that my question is the following. There was a tendency for the American administration to move the strategic impetus Mishal Al-Harti from the Gulf Academy for Strategic Studies. I think that there was a tendency by the American administration to move its strategic impetus to East Asia in order to pressure Russia and China economically and militarily, in addition to information-wise. And maybe there was an engagement in arming and expanding the expenses in the investment of ballistic missiles, etc. However, China was neutral and focused on the economic development, and it was doing that clearly. There is a competition and a rivalry that is of strategic nature between the superpowers, including the United States and China. The question now is, are the rapid changes and events like the war of Russia in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, do you think this event would change the equations and the tendencies for the United States and China? Or maybe there will be a continuity of these tendencies and trends? Thank you.
So the question is, do you believe that the conflicts in Ukraine or in Gaza or so will drive US or China to change their strategic objectives and your attitude towards arms buildup and projection? So I think the first question was to you, Colonel, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, I just tried to finish all the three questions altogether. First, on the probability of mainland China taking over Taiwan, promised by President Xi Jinping. First of all, Chinese president has never said that. Instead, in October last year, at our National People's Congress, when he talked about Taiwan issue, he said, we have utmost sincerity and would make utmost efforts toward the peaceful reunification. So that means at least by October last year, we are talking about peaceful reunification. And as I have told you before, defense spending is a true indicator of one's intention. People lie sometimes, but your defense budget never lies. It tells you more than anything about your true intention. So we're still patient, and I believe the American side knows this as well. I attended the Shangri-La Dialogue. James Crabtree is here, the director of IISS in Singapore. When I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, what impressed me most was actually the remarks by American Secretary of Defense, Lord Austin, when he said, a conflict is not imminent and a conflict is not inevitable. His remarks actually contradict with those remarks made by some American generals before, when they talk about the 2025 or 2027 scenarios when mainland China might attack Taiwan. The second question is really good, talking about the potential. We really have not talked about potential. Just now, Tim said that there is still a huge gap between the Chinese and American military. This is absolutely correct. But the point is, China does not have global military ambition. So long as we can safeguard our sovereignty and the territorial integrity, that is good enough for us. So then, talking about potential, Chinese military is really making advances by leaps and bounds. And we even have more ships than the American Navy. The number of ships, the quantity, is not a quality. But the quantity has a quality of its own, especially when it comes to Navy. For you to perform one mission, you need three ships, right? So this is the common sense. So therefore, quantity really matter. And we're making tremendous progress. That is for sure. And our aim is not a secret. We want to become a world-class military by mid-century. That is 2049. When PRC, People's Republic of China, celebrate its centenary. So the question is, what is a world-class military? I believe it's more or less neck to neck to American military, I say that because I'm not that sure, because China has not fought a war in the last 40 years plus. So whether an armed forces that has not fought a war could be described as world-class military? This is a good question. But my answer is, do you want to prove you're world-class military by chopping down other people's heads? By sharpening your sword with other people's blood? Right? You should not do that. But I believe nobody doubts that the PLA is making tremendous progress. Yeah. Finally, the question about how the war in Russia, how in Ukraine and in Middle East might affect our military, build-up. I actually would make this opportunity to highlight on some common points between China and the United States here in the Middle East. I believe China and the United States do not have conflict interest in this region. China should be happy with Abraham Accord, and the United States should be happy with China's successful mediation between Saudi and Iran. And we have two things in common. One is the two-state solutions. Both China and the United States support two-state solution. How does a two-state solution look like? Yesterday, people have so many discussions. I believe this best thing of two-state solution is that it gives people hope. Yeah, with this kind of two-state solution, even at a distance, people have hope. This war just added to common sense that Palestinians need to have its own home. That's it. It's nothing sophisticated. And then another common point between China and the US is on Iranian nuclear issue. In spite of China's good relationship with Iran, we do not want Iran to become a nuclear power, which is in violation of NPT. So China and the United States have common interest on this issue, which was the biggest issue before the conflict. I hope we can cooperate. I hope during President Xi Jinping's meeting with President Biden in APEC, they're going to talk about whether our two countries can actually do something, in the Middle East. Thank you.
Anthony?
I think one of the problems we really face here is almost no one in the audience, and I think sometimes I question, in the strategic community that is outside the people who actually have worked in government, really know what the numbers and the trends are. If any of you have an interest in how other people see these numbers and trends, please just give me your business card and I will send you a summary. It's complex and it's certainly not easy to present, but it does, I think, raise some issues I would have with the Colonel. First, I think, having worked these issues since the 1960s, would have to say that in much of the world, defense expenditure data is rubbish. And when we look at satellite coverage, it's very clear that Russia and China do not fully report a very large portion of their military spending data, and it was in the past that the IISS and CIPRI had two different numbers for each country. One was what they officially reported, and the other was the estimate of the think tank. What counts are the actual force numbers, who's deploying what, and at what rates. And these are things you can see and you can map. The other issue that I think we have been debating with China for some time is taking Chiang Kai-shek's claims to naval areas in the Western Pacific and turning them into China's claims under a communist government in direct violation of the laws of the sea does not really define what is legitimate national interest. And whatever you may think of an American opinion, look at the actual maps that are being issued by the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, other countries with counterclaims in the area. Chinese claims do not represent, by the law of the sea standards or international standards, the actual legitimate areas in the Pacific. How important this is, I think, is more a matter of prestige in some ways than the military. But I think here the problem we have faced somewhat in this panel, and I am not particularly happy with, is we had one set of subjects and we ended up in some ways talking about the US and China. We didn't talk about the US and Russia. We didn't talk about the patterns in NATO. We didn't talk about India or Pakistan or the other aspects of nuclear weapons. And let me say that I would hope that at some point in the international community, we can stop using the term AI permanently. I wonder how many people in this room even know what algorithm structures under AI are, and what their limits are, and what the necessity for their use is. It's become one of these horrible buzzwords on the internet and television. And I think that whenever anybody uses the term, you should ask them to define it. Because when you really talk about it, these algorithms have been going on now for decades. They're getting more sophisticated, but none of them involve neural nets, and so there is no real artificial intelligence, merely programming of algorithms to serve given different functions. How you talk about this and how you negotiate something that really, at this point, everyone is involved in trying to use militarily and move it towards arms control requires you to actually define your terms. It's an old-fashioned rule in academics. We don't mention it often, but we'd better start.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that will be an advice by the organizers that we need to end the session. I would like to thank all of you. We've had quite enlightening decision.